Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or good day wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the next episode of No Dice, No Glory. Sponsored by our jobs that actually pay us money, we're coming to you not at all live from an abandoned arms factory deep under a mountain in West Virginia. We are proud to proffer to you the finest in wargaming coverage. Without any further ado, let's get this show on the road.
Hey, well, thank you, Sean, for that rousing introduction. Today we have a special podcast, but before I head off and introduce these great guys, as you guys know, the things that we say in this podcast are our own opinions and do not reflect any organizations that currently hire us or may in the future plan to hire us. Once again, who listens to, four crusty gamers anyway? But special show. I know I hyped it in last week's podcast, but I have the guys from the School of Advanced Military Science. We're going to talk about wargaming, and I am going to have these guys introduce themselves. Throw out your names, gentlemen, and we're going to throw a little special in there. Tell me the game that you played sometime in your life that you knew that you were going to have a problem wargaming, lifelong addiction. So I'll start with you there, Jim.
Hello, I'm James Sterrett. My work job is that I'm the chief of the Simulation Education Division in the Directorate of Simulation Education at the Army's Command and General Staff College. And probably the thing that let me know that this is really an addiction was Jutland.
The old Avalon Hill game from 1974.
The old Avalon Hill game. It's either the first or second game I ever bought as a tween.
Wow. Mike.
Hi, my name is Mike Dunn. I work for James Sterrett at Director of Simulation Education at Army University. My first war game was War at Sea, but what really that hooks into me was Squad Leader. I've been hooked ever since.
Yeah, it's funny. People are going to think Avalon Hill was the only game company back then. It kind of was. And Eric Rowdy Price, welcome.
Good evening. I am the exercise director at SAMS, so I'm the one that puts together things for the students to do to practice what it is that we teach them. And I'm a relative newbie to gaming as an adult, really. I mean, I played games as a youth like Stratego and Risk and things like that, but military wargaming is something that's relatively new to me.
But it's fun.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. So what is SAMS?
Well, the School of Advanced Military Studies is a school that's made up of three different programs. We have the Advanced Military Studies program, AMSP, which is for our mid-career officers and civilians. So officers that have about 10 years of service when they come to our school. We have the Advanced Strategic Leadership Studies program, ASLSP, which is for our senior officers and civilians, and it's really the equivalent of the U.S. Army War College. And then we have the Advanced Strategic Planning and Policy program, ASP3, which is an Army-managed PhD program. And when I say Army-managed, we don't actually give out any PhDs, but what we do is we help facilitate Army officers going into graduate programs and getting their PhD so that we have those skills available to senior Army leaders and Army organizations. Our purpose as SAMS is really that we educate members of the armed forces, allied students, and members of the interagency of the U.S. government at the graduate level, and we focus primarily on critical and creative thinking. So we're a second-year program to the Command and General Staff College, and where they get general staff skills at the Command and General Staff College, we really focus on getting beyond processes to really thinking through how we deal with problems and come up with creative solutions.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of any school that wouldn't take me. Actually, I found out about it late in the career, and I just found out 2 weeks ago you guys have a PhD program. But yeah, I probably not smart enough. But so one of the things that I felt that's most interesting, it's kind of how we all know each other, is you guys use wargaming as a tool to teach these students. How long have you guys been doing that? How did that come about? and then we'll get into what the students think. You guys are instructors; you probably don't care, but yeah.
Well, I can give kind of the long arc description, and then I'll let Jim and Mike sort of talk about maybe some of the specifics that we've been doing at the school here recently. Gaming at Sam's in general has been focused on illustrating historical cases. We do a lot of sort of in-depth historical study to understand the complexity of operating within, acting upon, and anticipating outcomes while we're operating inside the human domain. That's usually done through really short practical exercises that might be a day or so and relatively limited in scope. When I was a student about 20 years ago, we used the Operational Art of War, the computer-based game.
Great game.
It is an excellent game. And we used that to work through a series of different military campaigns, starting with Napoleon and working our way all the way up to the 73 war, I think maybe even beyond that. And that was very useful. It was seminars competing against one another. So you might be able to win as the Arab coalition until you push the Israelis to use nukes or whatever, but it did help us to think more deeply about the problems that we were dealing with. In the school now, we have a variety of board games that we use, and I'm going to let Jim talk about that because he's been instrumental in helping us find ways to integrate board gaming into the program recently.
SAMS is one of the schools that we support, and across all of them, though not necessarily in any particular phase, they're not synchronized in this. There's sort of a pendulum back and forth of the level of interest in using war games in the classroom. And while Eric was a student, it was fairly high. By the time I got here in the mid 2000s, it had become pretty low at SAMS, and then now it's picking back up in significant measure because a bunch of the instructors started to get interested in it, and there's a revolution from below that we've been doing our best to support to the hilt. The key from our perspective in providing that support is making sure that the right game gets picked for the task. So if we simply roll up on their classroom with something random off the shelf, it may be a great game. It may be wonderfully fun to play. There may be all sorts of lessons we can point at that it could be teaching. But if it doesn't get at that day's lesson, then it's really a fail because we're not writing the lesson. Somebody else is writing the lesson. We've got to meet that. So when we work through this, there's a thing we call PDI, Purpose, Decisions, Interactions. And it begins with the purpose at its core is, what do you want students to learn from this event? Because if we can't identify that, then we're flailing around in the dark. It's also things like how many students are there? How long do we have? All of the sort of physical constraints that we've got to work with of time and space in order to make this event happen. From that, we're trying to work out in a discussion with the instructors, what are the dilemmas that students have to wrestle with in order to get at the purpose? And from there, then Mike and I are running off to say, all right, what could get at these dilemmas, set up a series of possible games that might work. We show them to the instructors. The instructors say yes, no, maybe. If none of them fit, then we try to understand the why so that we can refine our understanding and try to find something that will in fact work. Ideally, we find something that works, and then we put it into place and run it.
So one of the things I got to do a few years ago at Marine Corps University was help the folks out there, Jim Lacey, Tim Barrick, run for the War College students OWS. And one thing I noticed, I was there to help facilitate AIR, was that a lot of lessons they learned in the classroom started to really come together just by touching counters on a map. Have you guys found that it's great for validating education as well as realizing it for the students?
Absolutely. One of
Absolutely.
the classes that I co-teach with Dr. John Abel out of the history faculty is an elective officially called Case Studies and Decision Making, but informally called History Through Wargaming. So we've got 8 classes. We play 8 games. And the point is to drive home both differences and similarities between various periods in history. And the most common reaction we have to these games from the students across all of them, time after time, is, oh, we've been having lectures about topic X, whatever it might be, and now that I have to put it into practice, suddenly it makes sense. This is, in fact, a pretty good segue, if you'd like, over to Eric and the purpose of the SAMS exercise.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, we're trying to set them up. We got time, but sure, let's go into it.
Yeah, it's actually pretty interesting. And it's interesting that you brought up OWS because as we watched the situation unfold in the Ukraine over the last few months, last year we started having pretty lengthy discussions about moving our wargaming from simply these short PEs to maybe doing something a little bit longer. And our deputy director, who had been kind of following the work that the Krulak Center has been doing on OWS, he went out and bought 3 or 4 of those games to bring to SAMS so that we could look at them and start trying to figure out a way to incorporate them. And then as we prepared to do our annual exercise with the Marine Corps, which one of our 3 sort of long form exercises, 2-week-long exercises, they come out and facilitate that for us. They came out and on the front end of their exercise, they did Assassin's Mace for 3 days, and we were doing an operation in the Pacific, and the board game that the students executed was about the approach to this island country, not Taiwan, that we were going to do operations on. And so they did that for 3 days, and then they transitioned into the more detailed planning for ground operations once the landing would have taken place. And that really got me fired up, that there was clearly a place for doing board games in our planning exercises, because our long form exercises are really focused on the military planning aspect and not so much execution itself. But execution is a great way to provide feedback to students on the quality of the planning that they do. So we continued having some pretty lengthy discussions about how we could try to work wargaming into an exercise. And I reached out to Jim and Mike to talk to them about something that we could do for our initial exercise at SAMS, which lasts a week, in order to focus not so much on military planning, but on learning. And learning was the focus of the first block of instruction that the students went through before the exercise, focused on human cognition, how we think, how we learn, how we make our assessments of things through observation, how we act and then adapt and identify, overcome bias, all that sort of stuff. And so when I went and had this conversation with James and Mike and their crew, I made it clear that I wanted something that would focus on decision making, but would be more focused on the how we decide rather than what we decide, which is really what military planning is. And we looked at several games, and I even took one home. I think it was Nevsky. But while we were having this conversation,
Local Runke, great game.
Yeah. While we were having this conversation, James also kind of planted a little seed in my brain by mentioning the game Root. And he said, if we could really do one, this one would be great, but, we've never done it here at the college. I don't know if it would work. And I went home because he mentioned a word that's kind of magical to me when I think about planning, and that is asymmetry, that the factions in the game Root are asymmetric. And that really stuck in my head. So I went home that weekend, and I remember I thumbed through the rules for Nevsky, and then I spent the entire rest of the weekend online learning everything that I could about Root. And when I came back to work the next week, I got with him and I said, hey, I think this is the game that we want to play. And over the weekend, I even ordered a copy of for myself so I could start kind of messing around with it and see how it would work. And I think what we have found in the experience that we've had a little over a month ago was that Root was very well suited to our needs, and I can talk more about that as you see fit.
Oh yeah, I got a million questions. So it's funny about Root. Played it dozens of times. Never face to face. Mostly playing the computer and tablet versions. It's an amazing game. You know, it was interesting. Last week, I was talking to the new president of Georgetown University Wargaming Society, and one of the games that they were playing was Here I Slay. And the student I was talking to goes, "Well, it's not really applicable, for military thought, strategic thinking." I go, "No, it really kind of is when it comes to thinking, because I don't know if you guys played it. It's an amazing game. But yes, you're not going to be fighting monsters. Understanding what everybody else at the table, because you're playing against everybody else, is doing. It's about setting up your next move. And for a decision making game to see how we think, how we decide, I thought it was a great game. I think Root also is an amazing game. Stop, end of sentence. But I think for looking at asymmetrical fights, it's a really good game. And so the question I'll ask is, when you guys first brought it up, you had to explain to somebody what Root's about. Um, did you have to explain then why this was an amazing game for this? I think I know the answer, but I'm going to let you guys talk to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I knew that there was the potential that it would be a tough sell. I mean, if you look at the cover art for the game, uh, it looks like a kid's game with the brightly colored characters on the front. But actually, the way the game is even physically designed worked really well for us, and I'll talk about that. But what we wanted was something that was relatively easy, even if it was complex. And I think that the overall structure of Root is relatively easy. The rules are complex, and it takes a little while to kind of get into it. But picking something like that, the argument that I made was that it would eliminate the historical bias that is associated with fighting a historical game. Our students are relatively well steeped in history, so if we try to pick something with the Germans fighting the Allies in World War II, students are going to have a certain feeling about what they have to do if they're the ones fighting as the Germans, because they have these preconceived notions of the Germans and Blitzkrieg and all of those sorts of things. And so when you can take them out of the familiar, put them in an unfamiliar situation, an unfamiliar environment where they have to kind of set all that aside, then you can really get them focused on, how do I learn as I observe and interact with the other players in this system. And so what we did in terms of pitching it was I really focused on this idea of asymmetry and unfamiliarity, that it would be a way to put students in the affective domain. And the analog that I used is that our school, for the longest time, one of the very first books we read is Young Men in Fire, which is about smoke jumpers. And the reaction from students is always, what does this have to do with military planning? And it turns out that it has a lot to do with military planning, because military planning is problem solving, and jumping out of airplanes and fighting fires is also problem solving, and it's problem solving where you're putting your own life on the line while you're doing it. And the design of this game, the fact that it was unfamiliar and it seemed like a weird thing to be doing as a military officer, has this same effect on the student when they see it. Quite frankly, it has the same effect on the leadership. But by using the analog of that book, people sort of got the idea of what it was that we were doing. And I think the toughest sell initially was probably our seminar leaders. And those are the colonels who have gone through the senior program the year before. And then they're the ones that sort of facilitate discussion from the military operations perspective inside the classroom with their 12 students.
One quick question I have. You mean Young Men in Fire, right?
Yeah, Young Men in Fire.
Okay. It's a great book. And they even made a movie about one of his other books, but we're not going to discuss Norm MacLean. It is an amazing book. And I think you kind of state it properly. There's a lot to learn from that. How long have you guys been using war games to help with teaching at SAMS, or even at Fort Leavenworth with Command General Staff College in general?
Well, for SAMS at least, and I'll let I'll let James kind of address it more broadly in AU. But in SAMS, again, we were using computer games, the Operational Art of War 3, even 20 years ago. We did have a long break in there where a short break where we weren't doing any exercises at all, which didn't really work very well for our students. You have to sort of know how to practice the things that you learn in school. But then we still went through a relatively long stretch where we weren't doing much in the way of gaming, primarily because of the faculty that we had were not particularly gamers, and the seminar leaders weren't particularly interested in doing it. We had a PhD join us 4 or 5 years ago who came from West Point, and he's since departed over the last year and a half or so. But he was very interested in bringing war games back into the program. And then 2 years ago, we hired the retired colonel, PhD type, who was the director when I was a student, when we were doing wargaming, Dr. Jim Greer, who is also a tremendous advocate for wargaming in the classroom and what it can do. So he has really helped to kind of keep the momentum going after Dr. Mark Muehlbauer, the other historian I was talking about, left. So both of them have been really instrumental. James, you want to talk a little more about it?
Or one way or another, wargaming of some kind has been at CGSC writ large for a very long time. What ebbs and flows is the amount of it being used, and it ebbs and flows differently at different schools. So as Eric noted, there is a period where basically there was nothing at SAMS, and we would go over and say, is there anything you want from us? And they would say, no, go away. And then, as he said, because of some faculty who came in who were saying, hey, we really need to do this, suddenly in the last couple of years it has opened up. Likewise, there have been times at the majors course, the Command General Staff Officers course, where we have few customers, and there are times when we've got more. One of the things that I think is helping at the moment is that has been, for the past-ish 20 years, there's been a slow growth of the acceptability of gaming across the populace at large. More and more people are playing games, whether it's casual games on their phone or later board games with their kids or whatever. And as a result, people are, I think, becoming somewhat more open to it. And we've seen that simply in students as well as in faculty.
It
So
also
overall, we're seeing a growth there.
It also helps when folks in the Pentagon kind of band-aid it and saying, we need to reinvigorate gaming. So, crazy question I wasn't planning on asking is, we understand how war games look at learning and qualify a lot of learning. Has war games ever changed curriculum and syllabus?
It really depends on the instructor. And one of the things about getting acceptance from our instructor base is it has to be something that they want to use in their classroom. One of the worst mistakes that can be made is if it's something that is shoved down their throats by someone that they perceive as outside of the organization, other instructors. But once they do see it and once they embrace it, yeah, we have seen a willingness of some of the instructors to re-look at their course objectives and looking at ways that they could actually employ wargaming as a way to get to those same learning outcomes, whereas before they may have used a PowerPoint lecture, a seminar discussion. There's a more open willingness to actually look at using a game as a way to reinforce some of the precepts.
When I first showed up here in 2004, I'd been working on becoming essentially an academic historian. I was awaiting the defense of my dissertation when I showed up, and the thing that I started thinking about was, hey, how would I teach history doing this? Because I figured it would be terrible for me to be working in this field and saying, well, but you can't teach the stuff I studied for years with it. So, and at first, I found it very hard to sort of think this through because you come up through the system being trained to think that, well, you're going to do lectures or you're going to do discussions or they're going to do research and writing. And that's how you learn history. And what I slowly came to realize was you've got to take a very different approach. which is the thing that a good game is going to give you is the opportunity to walk 10 feet in the socks of somebody else. It's not really a mile in their shoes. It's not that powerful because the games can't be, in effect, complex enough to really get you that far. But a well-done game will put you in their shoes, their socks, and give you some sense of the problems and the pressures and the situations that they face and get you a better understanding of it. Why did these things tend to happen? Why did those things tend to happen? Why is it that this is challenging or that is challenging? And once you start to decide that the thing you're trying to teach about history is not names and dates, but that you want people to understand processes and drivers of processes, what are the pressures, then suddenly it opens up a great deal more for what you're going to do with the games. And the challenge then is one, finding a game that hits all the wickets of being suitable for a classroom, and two, that will match up what you're trying to teach.
Yeah, and actually go. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, sir.
No, I was just going to say, and interestingly enough, and maybe this is a bit of a corollary to your initial question, I think what we were able to do with Root this year for our first exercise has probably will probably prevent us from changing some of our courseware. So maybe it doesn't force a change, but it prevents a change that might have been made otherwise, because we had been doing just sort of a traditional, very short military planning exercise after this first course. And there was this constant frustration by students and even some of the faculty about how the exercise simply wasn't linked very well to what we had spent time talking about in the classroom. And it has led to discussions about, do we need to talk about that book? Do we need to have that book in the curriculum? And I think in the case of what we've experienced in the last couple of months, we've seen that we have found a way that we can get at some of these rather dense texts that we have and make them meaningful to students, so that we don't have to get rid of them and go to something that maybe is more military related.
Yeah, I do want to get back to the student reaction. You said something very interesting before, Eric, and I think some of us are on that OWS chain of emails, and I made the comment that a lot of gamers out there, especially hobby gamers, want these realistic games. And I made the comment, as soon as I move a counter, it's no longer historic. There is some truth to that, but it was interesting that you said that the biases of playing historical battle, players fall into, and I have to be honest, we do. Um, it, how how often did you see students doing that based on their perceptions of the capabilities of a particular force, as opposed to kind of embracing the entire environment that you're putting them in?
Well, one of the games that we have used here at the school for the last 2 or 3 years is Holdfast Korea,
Great game.
and it is a very great game. But I think one of the things that we see with students is that they do one of two things: either they fall right into sort of the historical approach that was taken by both sides, or they think that they're going to somehow completely break that, and then they do things that no longer even make sense within the rules of the game. And so I think it's really easy to get locked into a certain way of thinking based on your own experience with a historical case and how you choose to approach it.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think I find myself playing like, well, I think I know the history behind it. However, it's such a great learning experience. I sometimes do one of those two things. I fall into the same traps, or I try to break it and say, what happens if they did this? I just find that interesting. So
Yeah,
with the
that's one
student,
of the
yeah,
yeah, that's
yeah,
one of the challenges that we have to get student acceptance is what does this game provide that will actually provide relevance to what we're having them study and learn. Uh, I have found that games that are contemporary, that are actually covering actual campaigns and wars that we have fought in directly, actually, there's too much of a visceral emotional reaction to it. I remember bouncing off of Volkol's wonderful game, A Distant Plane,
Yep.
Because what Volko was describing in his game design did not match up with my own experience of actually fighting in Afghanistan. And halfway through my rant, I heard myself saying it and basically saying, yeah, and everyone's experience of that war is going to be different. Let me go ahead and not try to impose my own experiences and biases on it, but let me go ahead and be open to the game design so I can try to understand what the game designer is trying to tell me about the campaign and what lessons that I can come away with it.
The direct quote from Mike as he was on that rant, since I was present for it, was, but it also has to be playable. So yeah, I guess it's a good compromise.
Which people don't understand. I forgot the name of that Pacific game GMT has, and it's a monster game. And people are like, oh, it's very realistic. It's also, all right, I'll say it, not a lot of fun because it takes forever to play, and I still don't even know if I'm playing it right. So Mike, I 100% agree with you. I don't like playing conflicts that I've also been a part of. I remember at a miniatures convention they were playing um, Fallujah, and I actually said too soon. And it was interesting the crew that was around there. I just it kind of gave me like a maybe a little too soon. And the other one is, and maybe this is me, how can that be fun? Because it wasn't. Um, but that's the thing about wargaming. We tend to look at some of history's worst moments and we play them for enjoyment, but we also I think play them to learn a lot from them and understand the limitations that those decision makers were under. So when you guys brought Root into the class, and you got to love the box art, what was the reaction of the students, and then had that change as I kept playing through the game?
Well, I'll tell you that I think initial reactions by many were probably what we expected. They were like, "What in the heck is this?" But we clearly have more gamers in our Sam's class than even I would have anticipated that we had. And so overall, I think the result was pretty good. We had I think if we had a problem, it was that we had a few students who perhaps got a little too focused on mastering the game to win, as opposed to being focused on their interactions and trying to learn from their interactions to anticipate or to counter moves or whatever. But overall, it was pretty good. Again, our seminar leaders were probably the most skeptical, and we did a practice session with them a couple of weeks before we did the exercise. And several of them they weren't quite getting it. I think mostly because they were too busy. They were approaching the game from the perspective of someone who has to understand it in order to facilitate it in the classroom. And we really wanted them to just approach it from the perspective of learning how to play it as if they were a student so that they could see how it worked. But by the time we were done, I mean, here's a quote from a student in our survey that came out. And this particular student says, "It is incredible how much one dorky game brought together all the aspects of fundamentals, operational art, and inadvertently brought the students to conduct a quasi MDMP, military decision-making process, mental process to understand ourselves, the enemy, and the changes in the operational environment." So I think once we sort of got past the cutesy little animals and sort of visually what the game presents to you when you first start, they saw a lot of depth in the game and understood it for what it was.
Yeah, Cole really invented or designed a really good game. It's wildly popular. How many of the students played Root before they showed up at Sam's?
I would say less than a handful had played it before they came over. One of my monograph students was a gaming student with James and Mike last year, and so he helped facilitate for his particular seminar. What we did have was a lot of students once they found out that there was a downloadable version, there were several students, because our students are all super type A personalities,
Yes, they
that
are.
again were interested in winning the game. And so several students downloaded the online version and started going through the tutorials and trying to practice it ahead of time. One caveat that I gave to them, though, was that I wanted them not to scour the internet to find all of the, hey, here's how you play the Erie or the Marquis in order to win, because I wanted them to suss that out for themselves rather than have somebody else tell them how to do it based on their own experience.
Yeah. It'd be scary if some of those students found themselves in an enchanted forest one day.
But you were talking about the design of the game, and I do want to say a little bit about it, because I think that the design of the game, even the design of the game, tied very well to what it was that we had been teaching. So, for example, we read a book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he discusses the idea of what you see is all there is. And that's sort of like confirmation bias, but a little more broad than that. And it's the notion that our brains are wired to believe that the information that we have is all the relevant information that there is, whether it confirms our biases or not. And this becomes a problem because we tend to not look for the things that we don't see. And during the game, what I saw initially was that the student pairs, because rather than having 4 students at a table, because of the number of students we have and the number of games that we had, and that was an adventure all in its own. But so we had students play as pairs so that they would discuss options with one another. And what we saw was that in the early part of the exercise, the students sort of played their own game with no concern whatsoever for what anybody else on the board was doing. So if I'm the cats, I'm just trying to do the cat things. I'm trying to build and recruit, and I'm not really thinking about what anyone else is doing. It was 4 separate games going on the board at the same time. And that was, again, because we asked them, hey, don't go out there and try to really strategize before you come in here and experience it. In subsequent games, the teams would often get focused on the Erie or the cats because they're the largest, brightest thing on the board. They see the orange or blue meeples moving around, and those are very easy to fixate on. And you sort of miss that there's that vagabond pawn running around, and the alliance is almost completely invisible with green discs on a board that is green. And so they would get surprised by the sort of the slower scoring factions, late in the game. And then even later in the process, what we tended to see was that some teams would begin to shift their focus on whoever won the last game. Well, that's clearly the guy I got to worry about. And so they would get focused on what was most visible, and that was that most recent visceral experience that they had being defeated by somebody that they didn't expect.
As
And
the instructor, oh, go ahead, sir.
No, I was just going to say, I think that really that suggests some really deliberate and I think, quite frankly, brilliant game design from Cole, and the way it plays on our cognitive tendencies really came out over the course of that week.
So, as the instructors, as you're watching the students play the game, what insights into them and their decision making did you guys glean from that? Just watching them play Root.
I'm gonna let James or Mike answer this, since they were facilitators in the rooms, and I was mostly moving around to help wherever help was needed. So I'll let them talk about that.
Mike, you want to start, and I'll pitch in second.
Sure. What really stood out for me was how the students would, at the end of each game, is that they would actually go to the whiteboard and they would basically process the experience they just went through, and they were actively linking that experience to the course where they had studied prior to playing the game. So they were looking at how the game brought forth some of the different concepts that they were studying as part of this block of instruction. So it was really very, very interesting to see how they were integrating this new experience of playing this really out there game to concepts that they already knew. and just the way they were analyzing the game and analyzing and reinforcing what they had picked up in other modes of learning, reading and lectures and seminars. It was really wonderful to watch that synthesis occur.
As Mike's
That's
noting, the students were bringing in the courseware, and one of the points the point at which I really knew that this was working in terms of its educational intent was that on Monday we ran the training game and got them used to it, and then on Tuesday we started the so to speak the real quote unquote competitive runs. And by lunchtime on Tuesday, the whiteboards were filling up with the analyses that Mike was talking about, and that's what I'm saying to myself. Yeah, this is doing what we need to. But Eric mentioned that we had pairs of students in each place, which is something that we do a great deal of. We found that particularly when you're new to a game, and especially if you're a non-gamer, you're sort of alone and afraid as the new player in a new position, something you've never seen before. You're in front of your peers. You don't want to look like an idiot. And some people will tend to get very cautious or shut down in that state. But if I give you a battle buddy, a friend in that position, then you've got somebody to talk with, you've got somebody to bounce ideas off of, you've got somebody else who's sort of in your corner, and it tends to go a lot better. If you put in 3 or 4, then often at 3, almost certainly at 4, somebody's going to become a spare wheel in that process. So there's really a sweet spot at 2. The sneaky thing about that is it also means that if Eric and I are paired together, in order to discuss it, we have to vocalize what we're thinking. So it's not simply me sort of randomly cogitating to myself and conducting whatever mental shorthand I use. I've got to express it using some common language to Eric. And that's part of the reason that suddenly they start using the doctrinal concepts or the analytic concepts and frameworks that they've just been learning about. And in the process, they also make that thought process available to the listening instructor. So you can hear them start to use these and follow these analytic pathways, which is kind of nifty.
the manipulation of teaching is awesome.
Absolutely. The other thing that certainly was eye-opening, enlightening, and great is that on one of the final games, one of the teams had to be away because of reasons. There's some administrative thing that they were being pulled out for. So I had to sit in and play as the cats at their table, which was terrible. And I was most brokenhearted. Not at all. So I'm rolling into this and saying, "Wow, this is awesome! I get to play the game." And I've played the cats and I played Root a lot. I played the cats a lot. So figured, okay, uncorking sort of a standard plan as the cats. And the students who are the Erie have made one move that struck me as odd because they've started off with a leader who gets them lots of people, extra recruitment. I'm thinking, well, maybe that's a mistake because I hadn't watched this particular pair. They'd been shuffling between rooms. Uh, and they start sort of poking at me in the middle, and I look at this and interpret it as sort of a standard. The Erie's being aggressive to try to build some of its roosts. Okay, I think I get what's going on. And then suddenly they play a dominance card for the 2 corners of the map, which means that now they win the game if they control the 2 clearings on opposite corners of the map. And in the same move that they do this, they move every single piece they have to those clearings. So they got a huge force on them. And I look at that and say, holy cow, that was really well planned. Because they'd been doing absolutely everything to set themselves up to surprise everybody when they did it. And I reached across the table and shook their hands in sheer glee that they had pulled this off, and then turned to trying to make sure that they couldn't do it by punching at them with the cats. But I was thrilled that they had done that. That was awesome.
And as we talk about these factions in the game, some of the folks out there listening have not played Root, so I'll go on record saying check it out. It's a really good game. You could try the electronic version, but next time that you host a game night, definitely bring it out. I think it's a very hard game to master, and it's never played the same way twice. I've noticed that. It is such a fun game. Um, One thing I do want to ask you guys about, and because we all kind of work in a related field, is wargaming in the military in general. are we starting to turn some of these young minds? And I remember I played in your Drive on Moscow last year, and it was one of your students, Jim, I think, who was working on designing the war game. It was an amazing game. He beat me because I was too busy talking to him. How is SAMS and really Army education working to get wargamers out there to solve problems that the Army and really the Department of Defense has at large? Are we making a dent in getting folks out there?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I have jokingly called this the James and Mike show. It's our guerrilla insurgency that we've been running for the better part of over a decade, of trying to create a literal army of war gamers, folks that are versed in these concepts and be open-minded about it. We also try to teach techniques of how to use gaming, and we've all, I think, all of us here have seen war games that are really fantastic, and we've also seen war games that are just absolutely atrocious. And all again
Yeah.
comes down into the person running the game. And that's one of the aim points that we have is teaching these people not only how to employ a war game, but how to run a war game. Most of our students are actually going to end up being fairly significantly senior leaders in their organization.
Yeah, Sam's folks are sharp. SAS folks, I mean, these are some of the great thinkers. If you're ever in an office with one of them or you ever meet one of them, those are the folks that you really want to talk to. You talk about the insurgency. I think we're all doing our little insurgencies wherever we are within the enterprise. But I'm starting to see folks, especially in my building, really start to adopt wargaming more. I think I told you guys last week we did a chaplain's game, and it's because folks want a war game. They want to get to a point where they can take these problems, kind of strip them bare, and then figure out next steps. But it's applicable too, even if one day you get out of the military, decision making. And I think it's one of the hardest things to teach. Um, but getting these folks out, in the field, I think is a great benefit because the first thing that people see when they see a game is the dice, and everybody starts freaking out. How's the insurgency been going on your end, guys, in Kansas?
Well,
It's
I
going
think,
better. Go, Eric. Yours.
yeah, I think it's been going really well. I mean, Sam's, even in the years where we weren't doing a lot of wargaming, we typically had usually a student every year, every other year that would write about the value of wargaming in education, specifically related to professional development. But now what we're seeing students talk about is not wargaming as an educational tool in terms of PME, but we're seeing them talk about wargaming as a tool to use inside an organization to train your staff in order to help them work more closely together, to understand how each other thinks, and to test these ideas they have about how to do things in order to achieve the objectives that the organization is looking for. And I think that shows a shift that is taking place, that they're not just seeing it as a historical tool or something that is strictly about sort of, big E education, but that it's about more than that.
We get
Yeah.
a request from students probably once every 1 or 2 weeks. Former students emailing us back and saying, "Hey, do you have something that can help us do a staff OPD, Officer Professional Development, with this, or can help us prepare for some exercise, in whatever their current problem is?" And the frequency of those is steadily rising.
which is awesome because I think it pays dividends. One of the things I'll throw it out there for you guys to comment on is even playing a recreational game with people that you work with. I get to see how they process, how they make decisions, how they can work together in teams. I think the approach of having two people per side in route is amazing because the more we can do that, the more we can communicate. Because while we're playing route, it's a lot of fun, and we have the magic fires, but we may have to do it in real life one day, and I need to kind of know how people process, how people think. What do you guys think about trying to get more organizations to game, really to build teamwork and to kind of discover a little bit about one another.
Well, I think it's a phenomenal idea, and one of the purposes of doing this game was to do that. In fact, we ended the game on Thursday, and then on Friday we put them in a sort of like the leader reaction course kind of environment. Where they had to construct boats out of cardboard and duct tape, and then race them in the pool. And by boats, I mean boats that they could fit in, and try to get across the pool in them.
Real boats.
Real boats.
Real boats.
Yeah.
Well, that's
ironic for an Army organization.
I heard that the Army owns more watercraft than the Navy.
This is true.
And I think they own more flying machines than the Air Force.
And we've done more amphibious ops than the Marine Corps.
I was about to go there next, but those guys get really testy, and I'm sure they're biting their crayons now and getting very upset. But
that's
Marines,
why I always
airmen,
point it out to them.
Right, Marines, airmen do go to, and sailors do go to SAMs, which I have to tell you, as an Air Force guy or former Air Force guy, when you see a guy with I went to SAMs, I'm like, wow, because it's not easy to get into. If you're in the Army, it's even harder if you're in the another service.
Mike, you want to talk about team building in Kriegspiel?
Yeah, one of the things that we've had great success using is the old 1824 version of Kriegspiel. It's going to sound harsh as to why I like using it, but the reason why I have my students play a early 19th century war game is that it acts as a leveler. If I do something contemporary, it would pretty much favor infantrymen, cavalrymen, artillerymen, because they're versed in modern techniques and tactics. Whereas I jokingly say that I use early 19th century Napoleonic area warfares because all our students are equally ignorant about how it works.
Mm-hmm.
And it really provides a fantastic opportunity to exercise our doctrine of mission command, essentially empowering subordinates to make decisions to meet whatever the intent is of the mission, as detailed by the higher level commander. So it's really a wonderful experience to watch these our students who are seated at their own individual map with their own individual reporting umpire, trying to make sense in a completely alien environment from what they were used to make decisions in a very, very time restrained environment with a definite time pressure. I've had more than one student come up to me afterwards and say, "All right, now I understand mission command, understand the intent and disciplined initiative." And the other thing I hear more often than not is, why aren't we doing this more often? Why aren't we doing this sort of thing from day one?
Yeah, I actually brought up von Reichwitz today at work. Believe it or not, I said, if you do a bad game, don't go the way of von Reichwitz. And folks that understand Kriegspieling will get that. I hope some of the folks out there will. I get asked this all the time, and I'm going to shove this down to you guys as well. So I get asked a lot about from commanders out in the field, and actually all services. Hey, I really want to get my staff playing a war game, really team building, learning how they think, tackling a similar problem. They always ask me for recommendations. And it's like asking me what my favorite game or favorite song is. Well, that depends. Do you guys get those questions? And if you do, what are some that you recommend for some of the younger leaders or even more senior leaders that are out in the field that may be listening?
I'm a huge fan of the Marine Corps style tactical decision games. I used to use those when I was an actual uniform member in a National Guard unit, and I was using it to try to foster tactical decision making among my soldiers. What I didn't anticipate was the insights that we got into how we each think and arrived at the decisions that we got to. So that's one of the things I really recommend. Beyond that, I basically talk about the TDI model that James had talked about earlier, and that is, what is you trying to get at? What do you want your participants to come away with from the experience to hold on to?
My first reaction when people say, "Hey, we want to use a game for recommend something to us," is, well, what do you want to do? Because otherwise, you give them something that's useless, and they say, "Well, it didn't help us, so this is all stupid," and they walk away and they don't want anything further. And honestly, even if people tell me that they're looking for a game to have fun, I'd like to sign out. We have a lot of games in our simulation lab, and as we tell people, it's a please touch museum and it's a lending library. So please take them down off the shelves and look at them. And if you want to sign them out, check with us to make sure we're not going to use it in class soon. And if we're not, then hey, sign it out, take it home, have fun. But people say, well, what should I play? And the question always is, well, okay, let's figure out what you like so that I can narrow in the recommendation on something that you might want to play. What kind of complexity are you looking for? How many people you're going to play with? How long do you have? What sorts of topics interest you? And try to turn that into, hey, you need to play this game or you need to play that game.
You guys hate the question as much as I do. It's so hard to answer because you have to then shoot back questions. Well, what are you trying to get out of it? Because one thing about wargaming, hobby, professional, there's no lack of titles out there, which brings me to the next big question I'm going to ask is, you guys teach a lot of amazing concepts out there. Actually, all the military PME schools do. What is a topic you wish that we could game better or bring about a gaming experience to teach that lesson better to students?
Lots of them. Go, Mike.
Yeah, I'm pretty much having to think that one through. Um, if anything, one of the failure modes I see most often is the inexperience and understanding that an officer corps has with their basic function, be it an armor officer, artilleryman, or a logistician. And the reason I say that is we haven't exercised those skills collectively in a good many years. We were fighting the global war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq, essentially doing counterinsurgency and stabilization for the better part of 2 decades. And so we've really lost that institutional knowledge those of my generation had honed over many, many years at National Training Center and at different maneuver exercises in Germany out in the field. And now that we have gone back to training and preparing for that type of conflict, we are finding ourselves having to relearn some of those lessons. I used to joke that the war I trained for was to stop the 8th Guards Mechanized Horde coming across Boulder Gap and pray for the best that I'd be able to live in my tank. And so when I actually did go to war, I actually was given the keys to a up armored Humvee, or not Humvee, up armored SUV, totally, completely different from the type of war I was expecting to fight. I would hate to see that equation be flipped around for folks whose experience of war was counterinsurgency being caught in the position where the war they actually do fight is going to be the really large scale combat operation, where the consequences of failure are far, far more serious.
I
One of
did
the
not
things
give you. Go ahead. Sorry, Jim.
one of the things I know that I'm always looking for is games that do a good, elegant job, and elegance is critical here, in presenting the core dilemmas in orchestrating and operating and using supporting arms. Because typically we're pretty good at saying, oh, here are the primary killer arms and putting them into games. But then you look at logistics or signals or medical, or quite frankly, just the sheer brute force problem of putting a unit on the road and moving it. And that's often not represented very well in a game, so that the actual problem is present for you to solve without overwhelming the game and turning it into the only thing the game is about. Not a game solution, but something that we did last year. It started actually about 2 years ago. One of the logistics faculty asked our team to 3D print. We've got a small 3D print facility. to 3D print a support battalion. And from there, it grew to more and more of the units, so that this person could put it out in the middle of the room and show the students, this is how much stuff is in this thing. You're looking at all of these trucks and other pieces of rolling stock, and you're trying to organize that up and down the roads and provide security and all of that. And as this grew, eventually, over the course of about a year-ish, it got to the point where the next step was make the entire armored brigade combat team. And he did
One for
that
one.
for one. And he did that, and finishing this process took him about 6 months, which was printing them, was painting them, was in many cases making the 3D models for them, the computer models for them so they could be printed, because he could download a model for anything that has a big cannon. But if it doesn't, typically there's no model out there for it. So he would have to build that from scratch. And about the time he was done this, the general in charge of CGSC got wind of this and said, oh, well, you have to set this up as a display for everybody to come see. So we wound up with a 40 by 20 foot display of all of these on white mats. So that the 40 by 20 foot thing was 1 foot equals 1 kilometer of 1,300 minis, which wasn't everything, because it's missing all the trailers that don't have their own prime mover, and is missing all the stuff that would get sliced down into the brigade AO from division. And this was set out in a movement contact formation per doctrine with a couple other supporting things. And all the students got walked through here to see it and to discuss the implications of the sheer amount of stuff in it. It's jaw dropping when we had it out. It was jaw dropping to walk into. And that's the kind of problem that ideally we would have more compact, more elegant ways of getting through to people, that just getting them out of an assembly area is not simple.
And I would just,
And
I would chime in. I fully agree with what Jim just said. I know that with our students, it is very, very difficult for them to visualize what a large formation looks like on the ground. If you put a division on the road with all of its sundry pieces of equipment, it runs from Kansas City to Denver. If you just getting them on in, and that's just in tactical road march formation. That's not doing anything special with them. And our students really struggle with that, and there aren't good ways to replicate that. And so often, what we find in planning, as with board games, is that you have a icon or a token that represents a unit, but it doesn't really represent how large a footprint that organization has when it's on the ground. And I think our students really struggle with how are you going to fit all of these things onto the modern battlefield and be able to protect the things that you need to be able to protect, and have the roads open to move the things that you need to be able to move. And I haven't seen any way to really do that yet. I think, we used the old micro armor, when I was a young lieutenant, to try to do that. And I remember seeing 2nd Infantry Division down in the bunkers there in Korea with a huge terrain model to try to be able to show forces arrayed on the battlefield and how we would conduct operations in the event of an attack from the north. But that's really, really hard to do, both because of the resources involved just in trying to present that, and not having it be so overwhelming that a student couldn't move beyond that to then think about how to solve some of the problems that we face when trying to deal with just the sheer scope and scale of a large scale operation.
one day I am going to play with all the boxes of micro armor I have. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to get to painting them a little bit better. Going back to Mike's earlier point, say what you want about the Soviet Union, they kept us focused. I would say.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's, when Gorbachev died, I was like thinking, well, definitely kept us focused on that mission. I definitely think that what you guys are saying, I hope everybody out there is listening, especially you game designers. I think that you just got a big ask. It would be awesome if somebody could design that game. And I get asked this all the time from game designers. What would be a really cool thing to game? And I'm like, well, we probably don't have that kind of time. But a lot of it is like looking at what lessons you're trying to teach and understanding that, educational games are different than throwing a game out there that is going to look at some commercial success. So I know a lot of game designers listen. It would be awesome if one of them created that great game, but there's so many great games out there. And definitely what you guys are doing with gaming, I think, is exciting. And the fact that you said about this underground guerrilla movement, here in the DC area, I'll put Sebastian's name on it. We're trying to do that as well out here, but trying to grow gamers so we can solve some of these tough problems. So, guys, it's been awesome. I said I'll try to keep it to an hour, but I have some other questions to ask, and I'll just throw them out there, and we can throw that out before we throw it back to the studio. What are some of the games you guys are playing now that you're just addicted to, that you can't get enough of, and what is that one game on your shelf that you got to get to the table pretty soon?
Board game or a computer game?
Board game, computer game, miniatures game. You tell me.
I've always loved the Sid Meier's Civilization series. The 4X games really, really speak to me. And I know there's the big controversy about which version was the best, Civ 4, Civ 5, Civ 6. And I've had Civ 6 for a couple years now, and I'm on the fence about it. So I keep playing it a little bit more. And right about now, according to my Steam account, I've got about 11,000 hours invested in it. So I'm still studying it to see if I like it or not.
I'm going to have to add you as a friend on Steam, sir. Totally going to have to do that. Jim, I know you're a big gamer too.
Yeah, there's lots of things that tend to have me sucked in. At the moment on the computer, the two things that have eaten my brain are Elite Dangerous, the space flight sim, and Nebulous, that is essentially navies in space done by a current naval officer who is an electronic warfare specialist, and it's sort of kind of Harpoon in space or Command Modern Naval Ops in space. It's proving kind of interesting to me. The in terms of the number of things that we have on the shelf, that I have on the shelf, that I want to have hit the table, my shelf of shame is very large. And
Yep, all of ours.
even for work purposes, Mike and I have a stack of games that we intend to have hit the table because we're trying to evaluate them for our own use in classes. That is longer than my arm. It just goes on and on and on. And as we get the chance, we put them in and give them a spin. One thing that might be interesting, often the way that we give things a try is that I will learn how to play the game and figure out how to teach it to Mike. Then I will teach it to Mike just enough that he can move the pieces without breaking fundamental rules. And he says, okay, well, given my career as an armor officer, I'm going to do what makes sense to me, and we'll see whether or not his intuition on what would make sense, his trained intuition, makes sense in the game. And if the answer is no, it doesn't, then we've got to have a serious conversation about, okay, is the game wrong or is your intuition wrong? Let's really delve into that and see whether or not this thing is working. But if the intuition from his side matches what the game tells him is the right thing to do, then we figure there's a pretty good chance that it's teaching mostly correct lessons and not many incorrect lessons. And it's just gained a level in our estimation of its use at work.
You guys must be hella tough playtesters, which our community needs. Eric, you said you're new to it, but you play games.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm really hooked on Root just from the prep that we did to get ready for this exercise, so I continue to play it with my teenage son. I'm trying to get students and faculty to, hey, let's take an afternoon after class and play, mostly so I can figure out more ways to connect it to the curriculum in case there are things out there that maybe we missed that we can make sure and try to highlight for the students by asking leading questions. When it comes to things I think about wanting to play, part of me really wants to go back and try to find a way to bring the operational art of war into the school, because I thought it was very effective when we were using it. And again, it provided a competitive environment for the students, which was really good. But I also, I mentioned that we've bought 3 of the different OWS sets. And I really want to start getting those out and understanding how those games work, because what I want to get our students to is have our exercises not just be about planning, but have them do execution so that they get that sort of the objective feedback of the enemy in terms of what the quality of your plan was. And so I want to be able to tie planning and execution together for our students, and those seem like we might be able to make one of those work to do that.
Oh yeah, yeah. I could talk forever about OW. I actually have my own copy. I got I got from Tim, and I bring it into work because I think it's a great way for folks to see how a game represents real capabilities, and then as we execute the plan that they have to think about, in the group, how well that works to what they expected would happen. And once again, how many times you have to hit the I believe button. It's an amazing game system. I can't say enough about it, but one day we're gonna have Tim Barrick on and talk about it. But you can go check him out definitely on I think he spoke at when you guys hosted Connections.
He did.
Yeah,
I think
he did. He ran it there.
Yeah, and he's a junkie gamer. He and his brother.
Well, a story about Tim Barrick. So this is how I met Tim Barrick. I
Okay.
had been sent out to the DC region. This was the week before COVID, as chance had it, in order to talk to a variety of organizations about what they were doing with wargaming. This is the usual sync up stuff. So talking to the Army Models and Sims office to close the loop with them on a couple things, talking to some colleagues of ours at the Marine Corps University and what they were doing, what we were doing. And one of the things that I was slated to attend was a briefing on various Marine Corps war games. And we piled into the room, and a colonel walks in. And quietly, my heart sank, because all too often the colonel is the manager and the colonel doesn't necessarily know what they're talking about in detail about the systems they're going to brief. But I figured, hey, it'll be briefing. We'll see what happens. And as this goes through, some of the systems he's talking about are things that I knew. And people are asking questions, and this colonel is giving answers that are actually really good. Answers that show that he understands the system. And I'm saying, oh, all right, cool. You actually, at the very least, you've been well briefed by your subordinates. And a slide comes up for Operational Wargaming System. And I got very excited because I knew that Sam's had been asking, hey, we want something to do multi-domain operations. And I looked at that and said, might answer in the mail. So I put up my hand and say, hey, I'd like to see this. Could you show it to me? And so this colonel says, sure, I'll show it to you afterwards. And I mentally translated that as, I'll have one of my flunkies show it to you afterwards. But hey, I'm getting what I wanted. I'm happy. So afterwards, he leads me off into another room, and for the low, low price of helping him set up some tables so that they could run the game on the next day, we get the tables in place, roll out the mat, starts getting out pieces onto the map. And as he's describing the design process for this, the pronoun he keeps using is I. So I finally look at him and say, you're a gamer, aren't you? And he says, yeah. I say, me too. Cool. So it explains suddenly why it is that he knew all about the systems he was talking about and was giving great answers. But
I ran into him at Historicon. He had a Santa's bag full of games that he just picked up. World of War 85. He goes, "Have you played this? I own it." But he was telling me he and his brother for Father's Day weekend did all of Waterloo in miniature, and I'm like, I live 45 minutes from you. Did not get an invite. I'm lodging a complaint here, and I think next year at Connections, if I don't get sick, we all have to play a game together sometime, or invite me out to Kansas. I'll come anytime. But I said we try to keep it to an hour.
Yep.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for this. I've been excited and looking forward to this, and I would love to have you guys back on. You just say when, and definitely enjoy having you on. I'll throw it to you guys for any last words. But once again, I really hope a lot of folks listen to this podcast and hear about the great things you guys are doing, and maybe we'll get Cole down to Kansas sometime.
Yeah, we can hope.
Oh, we'd
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah, he's a busy man, but you know, I think he was very excited that you guys were using it, and I think he knows that he designed a really good game. So I'll throw it to you guys for any last words before we send it back to the studio.
Well, Mitch, I just want to thank you for having us on. I will say that we did invite Cole out while we were doing the exercise. Even if we could only get him on to by VTC or by Zoom or whatever to talk to our students, maybe at the end of the exercise. And although again, it's not an official government endorsement or anything, both Cole Worley and Clay Capra, his sort of head of retail there, they really kind of moved heaven and earth to get us these games in time to execute this exercise, because obviously the game sells out relatively quickly, and I bought mine and we couldn't get any more. And they put in some real effort to make sure that we had what we needed to execute. And I'm very, very thankful to them for the support that they provided in doing that. But again, thank you very much for having us on.
He jumped right on it. I think he was excited, as you guys were. And Mike and Jim.
Well, one thing, thank you for putting us in touch with Cole, because that started a process that saved our bacon. Though
Yeah.
the other set of people to thank is that when we weren't sure we would be able to buy enough copies of Root, we sent out on a mailing list. We've got people who are interested in war games in the military, most of whom are former faculty students, things like that, and said, hey, we need copies of Root to run this exercise at SAMS. Are any of you willing to send them to us? And we got a huge response. We got enough that we'd have been able to run it successfully, even if we hadn't been able to buy the copies that the guys out at Leader Games were able to find. And that, I was really humbled by that response, that we had people from literally around the world saying, yes, here, I've already dropped it in the post to you. Just send it back when you're done. One person said, just keep it because it's a spare copy. And they were doing that basically because they were saying, hey, this is cool and we want to support you. So we're deeply grateful for that.
Yeah, it's such a popular game. Mike, you're the last man.
Yeah, my message to the community is keep on playing games, and for those of you that are designing them, keep on making them. We will play them.
Joe and Brother Dunn.
Because we'll keep playing them. But once
still,
again,
we'll keep teaching with them.
yeah,
Yeah.
which I think we could do a whole show on that. But I'm going to send it back to Sean in the studio, and I'll wrap it up with these guys offline. But Sean, take us away.
Thanks so much for joining the show tonight. Remember to follow us on Twitter at No Dice, No Glory, and keep the conversation going on NoDiceNoGlory.com, now featuring our own message boards. Have a great night, everybody.